My son and I recently went to see the most recent Marvel release. It's a movie about Doctor Strange. He's one of the primary characters in the Marvel Universe. And he is, according to his title, a master of the mystic arts, which begs a little bit of a question about what mystic is. See, in the films, him being the master of mystic arts is manifested in the ability to open portals to different universes or cast spells that send power waves that knock over buildings or enemies. My son and I had a really interesting conversation about mysticism and religion and spiritual and what makes a thing spiritual, what makes a thing mystic after the film. I found myself referring to things that I discussed with Kevin Sweeney during this conversation you're about to hear. Kevin's book, The Making of a Mystic, is a really interesting take on his journey towards mysticism and his practice of those things that we might call, or might not call, depending on who you are, mystical. I think you will enjoy this conversation. I think you'll be challenged by it. I really enjoyed it. Check it out. Boom. We are actually off and running. Where are you right now? Where are you calling from?
I'm in Honolulu, Hawaii.
You are from Hawaii, or you ended up in Hawaii?
I'm originally from Los Angeles and came here right after high school and basically stayed. Although my wife and I lived in Costa Mesa for 5 years after we got married.
Well, you've lived a tough life there from Southern California to Hawaii. It's just been dragged around some of the darkest corners of...
The only places I've ever lived, and my wife and I went to school in New York City for a while, so I basically skip over all of the U.S. I go from New York to L.A., Orange County, and then to Hawaii, and the rest of the middle, I'm like, New Mexico and Tennessee is the same to me. I don't know what's happening.
What did your wife study in New York? Where were you?
Well, this was a long time ago. So we went to college there at Hunter College. It's a CUNY up there. It's on 68th and Lexington. So we went to college there for a little bit. And she lived in the dorms in Gramercy. It's like 25th and 1st, I think. And I lived in the Bowery by the Lower East Side before it was cool. Like, I went there recently. I was like, babe, I told my wife, I'm like, babe, the Bowery's like sick now. When I was there, it was like people want to speed walk through it.
That's very funny. Do you have a place that feels most like home? Does Hawaii feel most like home? Because you've been there since high school-ish. Like, does it feel like home? Is where you're born feel like home? Talk about what home is for you. Where's home?
Well, home is obviously where the heart is. So it's right here with us right now.
That's what I'm asking.
Well, geographically, I left where I was from in Los Angeles very intentionally. Are we recording? Are we just going?
Yeah, we're just going. We're just talking.
So I left Los Angeles at 18 very, very intentionally. So, that's a part of, the story. You can see glimpses of it in the book. You know, I had existential crisis at 17, mushrooms as a spiritual guide for me at that point, a spontaneous awakening moment with God at 18, and a complete rewiring of my consciousness and realtering of my life after that led me to give everything to that which I experience in that moment that would later on would identify as being present in Jesus, which is a unique story of how you get there. Yeah. But leaving Los Angeles for me at that point was, I'm trying to get sober at that point. I got to get away from where I am. So when I left LA, I was like, I'm done. Yeah. I'm done.
And contextually, you didn't see a pathway to stay geographically. There was a kind of is it about power? Is it about patterns? Like, what's that about where you have to leave a place in order to get healthy?
That's a great question. At that point, I'm 18. I have been in a life of, drugs and money and basketball and hip hop. And that was like my whole life at that point. And when you're in an environment, everything, we weren't even texting at that point, by the way. We had Nokia phones. We did have cell phones, but we weren't texting. I graduated high school in 2003. I'm 37. But everything's I run into this person in the corner away. Yeah. Everything is. And also, it wasn't just, I got to get out of here to try to get sober. It was, I just gave my whole life to prepare myself to play college basketball. And when I had this experience of God, I walked away from it. I was like, I don't want that. Yeah. I realized, I don't actually love basketball. My ego just needed what basketball did for me with a fragile sense of self, attention, affirmation, the whole story.
Yeah.
And music was the same. I was like, okay, I'm recording music. I was rapping when I was young. I just got offered a bunch of money by a well-known drug dealer in my neighborhood. I tell that story in the book. It was slightly unsettling walking into the house that day, but it was a good offer in the end. But my life was changing at a foundational level when it comes to my own consciousness and when it comes to my social everyday life. No more basketball, no more music. I'm literally leaving everything, going to Hawaii to be with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, and also responding to this experience with God.
So it's fascinating
I couldn't
to me.
stay there. I couldn't stay there.
Yeah,
for me, I was like, I'm getting away.
That's why I asked the question a lot, is because there's a way in which it seems pretty regularly that actual places, the ground beneath our feet, in a way, like, it holds our experience of life that I am in. Like I feel it in my body and I experience it in my mind. I have thought, but the place I'm living in actually holds to some degree that experience of life. And there's a power that place has in my patterns, but also over me. That at times, like I don't have power over that sense. I don't have power over the place I'm in. I get to belong to it. And sometimes it really does take having to divorce myself from an actual location in order to find newness. Are there things like specific to Hawaii, and where you are in Hawaii culturally that make it easier for you, or maybe easier, the more how should I say, more naturally support your health and growth? Is there something specific about the culture you're in, the pace of life? What is it about Hawaii for you? I mean, it's one of these questions. It's not like I mean, you already know this. You get this a lot, but like, it's not like tell me about Toledo, Ohio. What is it about Toledo? Like, I'm like, hey, like, it's like, what is it about Hawaii? But for you specifically, like, what is it about Hawaii, the pace of life, like, that supports your health and growth spiritually, psychologically? Why there?
Yeah, I would say it's really different because that was when I was 18 and I'm 37.
Yeah.
So now I could be anywhere and be healthy now because, I've been so far out of that. But at that point, like, I'll tell people at 18, besides, like, after I had that experience of God, I never did psychedelics again, and I never did hard drugs. It took me a couple years to quit smoking weed at that point. And for me, I'll say, man, no matter how powerful psychedelics and other drugs were, no matter this, the biggest narcotic for me to wean myself off of was attention and affirmation.
Yeah.
That was more powerful to my sense of self and to my ego than the other things were. And so at that point, when you talk about health and creating a path of flourishing, when I was at that age in a big transition, when I moved to Hawaii and I went to college out here, I went from being like that guy to nobody.
Yeah. You weren't known.
Bro, nobody. I was invisible. Walk through the halls. No one says what's up to me. I'm just a haole guy. For the people who don't know, that's basically what they call white. Just like a haole who's with a girl who looks local because my wife's Asian and she's very tan, but she's actually from LA too. But like, they assume another freaking kook haole with a local chick, like, and because I'm not in the party scene, I'm not even like partying with people. I'm like, that environment of invisibility and not being seen, which is one of the spaces people avoid at all costs, was the very site of me being born again. Because every day when nobody sees me, I now have the practical embodied opportunity to ask myself, is being seen by the very source of love enough? So I would think on a bigger picture, that was the most important thing for me back then.
Yep.
That dynamic every day in a day-to-day, the mysticism of the everyday life is when nobody sees me, I don't have the option to be like, look at me, watch this jumper. Like, oh, you guys want to hear me rap? Hi, I'm Kevin. You want to hear me rap so I can feel better about myself for a minute? No, every day is no one sees me, but it's an opportunity for me to trust that being seen by the very eyes that are at the center of the universe seeing me is all I have, because it is. Besides, that's all I have.
So you use the word ego a bit in the book. I do a thing on with a lot of my guests. I just call it like it's a practice of lexicon. The words we use tend to reframe our experience, sometimes even dictate our experience of reality. like what I call a thing can change what I mean. It can change not just what I mean by it, but like how I experience that. So part of why we write books is, which you've done, is to reframe the way people understand things by way of language. And there's some language of the book. What I'll do is I'll just throw these words at you, ask you to talk about this a little bit, and then I'll do kind of a longer form version of it this time because I'll ask some questions in between. But I want to begin with ego and just say, like, when you use the word ego, what is an ego? What is the ego?
Okay, one, because we jumped in so quickly, I'm going to take the liberty to just suspend that question momentarily. I'm
okay,
going to
cool.
return to it. One, so grateful that you're having me on.
Oh, thanks, man.
You know, just as a first-time author, before people have seen me like on other podcasts, because I'm just recording them all right now.
Yeah.
For anybody to take the time to bring me on without seeing me and other things, like, it means so much. So I'm so grateful for
you're
this.
quite welcome.
I really am. Two, 2009-ish, I'm a part of Rock Harbor Church in Costa Mesa. There is a retreat that they do with some creative people from the church somewhere in Northern County, San Diego or something. Who is it led by? Justin McRoberts. I remember you from back then. Years later, I was like, oh, I remember that dude.
We got some history. That's really good, man.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that before we move on. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Now, the language, you know, for me, I'm the type like I don't take the time to always explain the language I use. I just assume it, and you kind of just figure it out. If people have a world of a language and imagination and their own little economy.
Yep.
But for me, those words of ego, your separate self, a small self, your false self are all used interchangeably.
Yep.
And the ego is that sense of self that has been constructed for me, and that gains its strength and foundation outside of God and spirit and being known by those eyes. So it is it is a self that is based on external formations. What do I do? Who am I? How do people perceive me? It has no actual grounding, centered point, immovable foundation, and that's why it's so fragile.
Talk a little bit more about false. When you say true self, you talk true self, false self. When you talk about the false self, like is it entirely a bad thing? Is the false self a bad thing overall, or is usefulness to the false self?
Yeah, when it comes to the relationship between your false self and your true self, and actually depending on who you talk to and how they view states of consciousness, there are selves that are larger than even your true self. But that would be be a further thing. But no, there is no judgment of value when it comes to this natural and for most of us undesirable, simply because you get caught up in it, movement between your false self and your true self. You know, your ego structure, your ego sense of self, that's just your default patterns. That's the wisdom of the Enneagram and personality things, where it's like nobody chose their ego structure and the shape of their ego. That's good. Genetics, predispositioning, cultural dynamics, family systems, right? No one chose their default patterns. Like, no one, if you're familiar with Enneagram, no one says, hey, I want to be a 3 one day.
Right.
You know, it's like, no, your own mysterious coping mechanisms with the unique makeup of your life made you into that. And that's how you became how you are. So
that's good.
You know, your ego self is just that sense of your primary sense of self growing up that exists, you know, day to day. It's not even something you look at. It's something you look through all the time. And it's not bad. It's healthy. You know, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. You have to have an ego before you transcend your ego. And that foundational sense of self is helpful. It's just extremely limited if you want to move into a further place of liberation. If you ever want to move into the second half of your life, if you want to move into, like, there is a movement of encouraging the self on the way to success. That would be your ego. And there's a movement of dying to that self on the way to freedom. That would be dying and collapsing into your true self in Christ that does not have to hold on to anything your ego used to hold on to, because it experiences at a foundational, it is being held.
That's good.
By the very source of the universe. So even recently I was talking to people and we were talking about, you know, what do you want? Right. And being comfortable as people of faith asking that question, what do I want? And I would tell people, the question is not, you being afraid or asking the question, what do you want? For me, the foundational question is which you is doing the wanting.
That's good.
If the you is your ego or false self, you can go and do all those things. I could care less personally. Go ahead. But if it's your ego wanting things that's going to meet the insecure needs of that, it's not going to lead you to freedom. It's just going to perpetuate cycles of stagnancy of where you don't want to stay. But if it's the wanting and the desires that are indigenous to your actual true self, that are authentically your own voice, that wanting is what is going to lead you to freedom.
That's really good. In that sort of in the shadow of that, I want you to talk about the word truth, because we talk about true self versus false self. How comfortable are you with the word truth? What does that mean in the broad sense? The word truth.
I mean, I'll be honest, even though like my wife and I are co-founders of a church we live in the unofficial arts district of Honolulu. I mean, I could turn my camera and I'm like in downtown, basically. I'm on the 37th floor out this window. And I don't use that word a lot, to be honest.
Yeah.
Especially in the propositional belief sense of like, these are the truths I believe about describing reality accurately. Like for me, truth is not primarily how we describe reality, although concepts are helpful. Like what you said, they name and deepen our experience. That's a profound thing and why language is so powerful. But for me, truth is the embodied way we interact with a reality that's dynamic and unfolding. So a capital T truth in a conceptual way, I just don't really use. I just don't really think about that. But truth is, I mean, my guiding question as a teenager in my own existential crisis was, all I want to know is what's real. That's all I want to know. I wasn't searching for Jesus. I wasn't searching for God. I just wanted to know what was real. And my primary, and this was a defining thing for me, was my primary foundational immediate experience of faith was not believing in any truth in a conceptual sense. It was the radical experience of a direct knowing of a universal affirmation of yes and love over my life. So
that's good.
You know, and even though as a pastor, I don't really am not concerned with those arguments about capital T truth. I'm like, are we living truthfully? Are we loving well? Are we experiencing joy? I kind of more move towards that.
Talk about church for you, experience, history, meaning, health. Talk about church.
You know, I have had good experiences with church. And I did not, like, my mom and I recently were talking about this actually. And I went to Catholic school first, second, third grade. And then I went to public school right after in fourth grade. And for me, and 9 years old, going to a school where in LA Unified School District where you can cuss and fight and it doesn't really matter that much, that was salvation for me at that age. I was like, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. This is the moment of lift off for me.
That's good. That's really good.
This kid's cussing at me. We're fighting. I've made it. Mama, I'm here. Don't take me back. And like soon after I just drifted, like, I don't want to go to mass. And my parents didn't push that on me. And I'm grateful for that. And I told my mom recently, I left that experience with what I call a pleasant indifference, where I just didn't really care. You know, it wasn't, I didn't have I didn't have trauma. I didn't have oppositional energy. I didn't have anger. I didn't have any antagonism towards the church, which later on in life, I'm so grateful for.
Yeah.
But I also didn't leave with, you know, a sense of, this is what it means to be connected with Jesus. You know, this is the way. You know, you can directly know God. I didn't leave with that either. It was just like, like that was a thing and that was okay, but I don't want to be a part of it and it's fine.
Yeah.
And when I was like, one of the chapters in the book is called Mushrooms and Missionaries. And it's about how, if you think of a missionary in a broad sense, if you suspend the colonial, dominating, you know, racist, Eurocentric dynamics of that word for a sec, because language is important, like Justin said. But at its best, a missionary is someone who's pointing someone further towards Christ.
Yes.
And in that sense, if that's true, then mushrooms were a missionary for me because they were pointing me further towards the source, right? They were, when Buddhists and Rohr talk about spiritual practices as fingers pointing to the moon, mushrooms were pointing me further. And I sensed that. And I knew that. It was like I kept experiencing the mushrooms saying yes, but keep going. Yes, there is a glimpse, there is a taste, there is this peak, but I know whatever you experience on the peak has to be transformed to who you are on the path. This is the peak, and it's pointing you towards something. It's a glimpse. And eventually, when I had that first dynamic experience of Christ, of God, of love, however I would have named it, I never did psychedelics again, because I'm like, the signs have been pointing me to the ocean, and now that I'm in the ocean, I no longer need the signs. And I never went back to them. And even at 18, when 6 months later, I'm like, oh man, it'd be cool to shroom again. Just because, yeah, it's, for me, it was spiritual, but it's also people just want to trip out, and get all groovy. And when I had that impulse to do them, I said, me returning to the signs would be to betray the spirit they've pointed me to. And it wasn't like a pastor. I felt that within me, integrity and alignment. Like, I don't need to go backwards anymore. They've pointed me. I need to live my life in the ocean, and maybe perhaps, depending on who you talk to, as the ocean. Yeah. And so a couple years, like when I was in Hawaii, a couple years later, I didn't really go to church too much. I did. And I was like, cool, like sermons. I've never heard these. This guy is awesome. And then I went to Rock Harbor and had a good experience. And my wife and I came out and started a church. So I haven't, like, the church the last 10 years is the one I created. That's good. And it's amazing, and I love it. So that's been so helpful, because when we came to Imagine, that's the name of our church, I'm like, at the CAC Roars thing, they're like, the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. So when I came into Imagine, my energy wasn't fighting the old. Yes. It was building the new. And that was 10 years ago. I didn't come in with antagonistic energy. Yeah, I'm going to be honest, and I have my critiques, and I'll tell you any of those. Yeah. But I'm not physically and physiologically feeling the need to fight the old. And we built something so unique where I was like, I'm not spending my life dealing with critical emails on Monday morning from parishioners who are trying to hold the center. I don't care. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I'm not doing that. I'm bad at emailing back. I probably won't even respond, even if I wanted to, I'd forget or something. Yeah. But no, like, our energy is out here on the edges, creating the new, and I have my critiques of the old. We're all continuing, we're growing. It's all part of the same tradition. And so for me, I get all that. The trauma, the antagonistic, I don't judge people for that. But for me, I've been grateful, because I've had so much less unlearning, undoing, and not the anger. Like, I didn't have that in that sense.
In that context, you used the word deconstruction when you were setting up the book, when we initially first started talking. I mean, even in initial communication about the book, the word deconstruction comes up. It doesn't come up a lot in the book per se, but it is part of the cultural soup among the religious now. Talk about your experience of deconstruction. Whether, like, do you resonate with that word? Talk about your experience of like what's become. And I hesitate to use this because I don't personally love it, and my biases are pretty publicly known. But like what has become known as like deconstruction culture. Talk about your experience there. Do you resonate with this? Talk about deconstruction for a minute.
Yeah, it's trippy and funny for me how big that word is right now.
Yeah, bro.
It's so fascinating. And I get it, because, I go from this wide open experience of God in this contemplative, imagine like a wide open field. I ended up at a Bible college in San Dimas. It's the Life Pacific. It's a Foursquare Bible college. Yeah. And I had a good experience. Like, the people there were great. And about a year or two into it, I was like, okay, it was like, I'm out here in this wide open. They give me this really, tight box theologically, and here's your foundations. And about a year or two in, I'm like, that's helpful, but my life is going beyond this. Yeah. And if you zoom out to simplify things, right? I'm more of like a big systems thinker. I'm not a detail oriented person. I'm like, let's look at the bigger pictures. If you zoom out from my perspective, when people are referring to deconstruction right now, it's actually just a move from one stage of faith to another. If you look at Fowler, it's from 3 to 4. If you look at spiral dynamics, you're going from blue to orange or green. It's the first big paradigm shift where people are stepping outside of their beliefs instead of looking through them and looking at them and reflecting upon them. That's great. That's important. But that's just one stage. Yeah. You're gonna go through other stages later, hopefully, if you keep evolving. And for me, and I would assume you have your own version of this, that first paradigm shift of moving from one stage to the next, taking things apart, what's real, what's not, it's bigger than this, what about, this is just tradition, this is because I grew up like this, and going through that first paradigm shift for me was happening, 13, 14 years ago, maybe something like that.
Yep.
So I would have a similar energy at 23, that I see in the broader culture now. But that's because that first big shift towards the postmodern, towards the grain or the spiral, whatever you're using, 13, 14, 15, 20 years ago in the broader sort of evangelical, at least where you can see publishing type of stuff culture, that was very marginal.
Yes.
Emergent church, Brian McLaren, why is Rob Bell saying this? Doug Padgett, he's like this, and yeah. I'm like, they were doing that publicly 20 years ago. And many people who are over the age of 35 were involved, connected, learning and growing in that stage. So now I'm like, I get it, but I'm not there. I'm like, that is a first major stage of growing and evolving. And there's so many more stages of growth and evolution after that I can understand it, but my energy source is so not there.
Part of what I've resonated with in your book and in communication is I don't have an issue with. I think I mean to say this. I don't have an issue with deconstruction as a concept. I'm a little bit of the stickler, obviously, about language and how we use it. And part of what I'm resonating with you about is that if I over-identify with a particular understanding of what's happening in me, I might actually miss what's happening in me. So when you talk about moving from one stage of faith to another, the way you describe a lot of this in you and in the culture around you, it has more to do with, and Rohr talks about this a lot, but like inclusion and transcendence. That like, it's not just a matter of like, we found this thing corrupt, this is awful, we need to tear it down and move on. It's also not like, hey, nothing I've ever believed is true and now there is no center. You're growing. And your past, just like your false self, this is an element of who you were, and by the way, are. And you can see this from the outside now, and you're transcending. To be able to recognize it in that context, I'm comfortable with deconstruction from that perspective. But when the over-identification with the sort of broad, semi-adolescent, angsty, toothy, snarky, just critique, doesn't get folks very far. And we end up in that dead end where like, this is no longer about my growth and what's going on in me. This is just about having a critique of a thing. I enjoy your angle, your posture more in the direction of like, there's a thing happening in you. There's growth happening in you. You will transcend things from your past they will still be included in your person in some way, shape, or form. There's just more of you now. I really like, I vibe that.
My book and in my like life as a pastor, which my wife and I started a church at 28, and now where I'm at, which is obviously, almost 10 years later, my book is not, here's where I was at 2021 in Bible college.
Right.
Here's how I did this, and it's not that, and it's not just the rapture, and it's new creation. It's actually bigger than this, and it's justice and the whites, like that. I don't spend my energy telling people how I got from here to there, step to step. I just am where I am.
Yes.
And where I am is I'm interested in life and freedom and creating more and possibilities and other people's journey and guiding them on that. Mm-hmm. And that's a unique thing. So the wisdom, the vision, and the clarity, and this is not an arrogant thing that I might have on some things or that you might have. What's funny is your wisdom is not what people who are in that angsty place want or need right now.
Nope.
But there will come a time for them as they grow through that stage and they recognize it as a stage, and perhaps hopefully, like you said, realize the ways in which their ego has now attached to that as an external source of identity. I'm not like that. I'm not this. I'm the one.
Exactly.
It's like, cool. That's not helpful forever. There will come a time, and that's why when I sent this out to people, I wrote something like, while the culture's talking about deconstruction, something, and things falling apart, this book's written from light, joy, and freedom on the other side. Because after that, guess what? The work continues.
Yes.
What are you going to create? How are you going to love people? Are you going to become more free? You know, how alive, how awake, how present are you going to be? That's where I am. And so that's a funny thing to have that wisdom and the grounding, and to say there will come a time where the broader culture that's everything's deconstruction right now will need wisdom, life, and guidance beyond it. It might just be a few years from now. And that's why the voices of people like yourself, the energy of someone like Amir, other people says, hey, after that, life just keeps going.
Yep.
And then you can't fight that part for the whole. You want to be mad at mom and dad because they watch Fox News? Go ahead for a while. You want to fight with your family on any form of social media because you can't help yourself, you know, because you're so over-identified with this and having such a hard time including those parts of you that transcending. So you're hating it in your family because you're really hating the fact that you were a part of it. Like, come on now. Yeah. There will come a time where that energy gets uninteresting, boring, and starts to crush you. And you're like, oh, the spirit is calling us beyond that. So I get it. Yes. I just don't get it in me because I'm not there.
Yeah.
You know? So yeah, I just laugh because I'm like, oh, like if you want to know about this, you could just go read a McLaren book from 20 years ago, you know, or what. It's the same thing, you know.
That's good.
Just less angry now in some ways, you know. I mean,
let's
more
hope
angry
more angry
now.
Yes, you know? Yes. It is more the energy now is to be pissed about it, which is fine. Just don't.
Well, also there's money in deconstruction now, so also that
always makes it hard.
There's money in clicks now.
I want to talk about a moment in your book. We talk about transcendence and inclusion. I'm going to read a couple excerpts from the book. They're all very short. You mentioned going to church. You mentioned sermons. And you said just now you mentioned sermons and going to church in Hawaii and San Diego, and then here you write, through the past 15 years, most sermons I have heard are encouragement for the ego, management techniques for the false self, and a path of holding together the very self Jesus said needs to die. And then you say this: most preaching is cheerleading for the ego, which is why Joel Osteen is not bad. So I would love for you to elaborate a little bit on this. One is like, just the phrase Joel Osteen is not bad. He's a really easy target for folks who, either feel like they've transcended or they've moved on or whatever. Joel Osteen is a very easy target. You said Joel Osteen is not bad. I'd love for you to elaborate on that. And then to go on a little bit about sermons, teaching in the context of church. Most sermons I've heard are encouragement for the ego. Elaborate a little bit more on this thought, but begin with like Joel Osteen is not bad.
Well, when I say that, statement, most preaching is just cheerleading for the ego. Yeah. And I believe that because when we began this conversation, or at least early on, we were talking about the ego and the false self and what the ego is. And the first half of your life is building, strengthening, and encouraging the ego. Yes. Hopefully, not everybody gets there, but hopefully the second half of life is dying to, letting go of, and transcending your ego and collapsing into a self that it transcends much further than your external sense of yourself. Yes. So the preaching that I hear is, if some pastor's just going off on this rant about, you have the divine helmet of salvation. Like, I'm not like the best Bible memorizer. Like, you have this thing right here. You are a child of God. It's like, okay, well, what I see them doing is actually fortifying and strengthening a person's ego. They're giving them a sense of self. They're giving them a positive self-image, like, because not everybody has that. And so developmentally, that's okay, because some people need that. Some people need to be reparented. Like, honestly, sometimes when I hear preaching, I'm like, it sounds like they're talking to kids. It sounds like they're talking to teenagers. It's like, this is a perpetual youth group right here, just with old or older. And so I hear that, I'm like, is it bad? No. But that is not radical transformation. That is not liberation from the self, like I believe Jesus invited us into very clearly. That is the first half of life, the first stage of strengthening the self.
Yeah.
So preaching is cheerleading for the ego. You can do it, buddy. You're great. You can make decisions. The world's not against you.
Yes.
God loves you. Okay, wow. That's awesome, because I grew up in a house where people told me I can't do anything, so now that's important.
Yes.
So when I say Joel Osteen is the ultimate version of that, he's like, you can smile again.
Yeah.
You can do that. You can get a job.
Yeah.
People are like, what who is this genius?
Right.
Yes. But I'm like, Joe, I go on to say something. He's like the sweet uncle who sees you, gives you a big hug, and says, you're doing a great job, little buddy. Keep going.
Yeah.
But what the further journey of us is to let go of the very self that Uncle Joel is smiling at and encouraging.
And part of the trick here is, if I am, with regards to like the stages of faith or the stages of human development, if and when I am the little buddy, that's exactly what I need.
Absolutely.
And to confess in that moment, this is what I need. Even if I return to that stage later in life, even if like I move through, because in some ways, like we cycle through. In some ways, like I get to a certain place, and I'm not beyond needing someone to come alongside and champion me in that way. Like there is no, we talk about.
Can I just go to Uncle Joel's house for one night? He's so nice to me. You guys never affirm me.
Exactly. There is a humility in recognizing this kind of spirit. That, this is, we're going to get to conversation here about mysticism. There is a kind of freedom, I guess, in recognizing this kind of path, this kind of process, that in the same way that you just said, like, my book is not like, this is where I was, this is where I am, it's how I got there, get here with me. It's like, I am where I am. Well, part of that, it's not just cyclical, but like I do return to stages in my life where, like, you know what, in the same way that there are seasons like I need to rest, and seasons I need to work, seasons I need social life, seasons I need isolation. Like there are seasons in which, like, so long as I live with a false self in some way, shape, or form, which I will for the entirety of my life, I recognize that aspect of me still needs care at times. And so whether it's therapy or the right people to say the right things, those are, if I can confess it in humility, those are things that I still need. The trick ends up being somehow is if as we are in that that little buddy phase where like I need encouragement, we're also acting like we can be adults and parents. Like, no, be where you are. In humility, recognize the limitations of your own place, recognize the limitations of the things available to you and what you need, and be where you are without casting judgment or like projecting your moment over the entirety of everyone else's spiritual process.
Yeah, there's yeah, I think one, with what you're saying, everybody has an ego, and you can transcend, grow beyond, but that doesn't mean you eliminate your ego completely. It means your ego has less and less power over you, and it's less and less in the driver's seat of your life.
That's good.
So less and less, like Mirabai Starr, who to me is one of the great living mystics in the West, who I just, love her stuff, says, the false self, and I think she says false self in the moment, or the ego, the false self is a practical joke that we keep falling for. So,
that's really good.
Like, why did I just try to prove myself to that guy again? Oh, that's that little part of my ego that wants to give someone my resume to make me feel special. Oh, I fell into that. Don't need to judge myself. Yep. I just wasn't trusting in my true self in that moment, and I'm going to return to that. Okay, cool. That's how it goes. I think in a practical sense, in terms of like pastoring and having these concepts in mind. Like I tell a story in the book. Imagine our church always had a unique wave of athletes from University of Hawaii like coming through.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point there was 2 quarterbacks from the football team who were a part of Imagine. And this is in the book. And one of them was like a redshirt freshman who was maybe supposed to be the next guy, like NFL quarterback body, like 4, like that whole thing, but he was redshirting. And there was another kid who I knew really well who was older. He took some years off before he went to college. He was older. He was a walk-on, like a real like Rudy story. Great kid, like pastoral heart, wants to be there for the guys, loves the game, loves competition. And I remember during that season of their lives, the conversations I would have with them were very different. One of them, as he's like, I'm going to be the man. And the other one's just kind of like, I'm on the team and I made it. I walked on. He was like so happy and he was in a different place. One of them, when I would talk to him, it was like, hey, this is the younger kid. I'm like, you got this. You have to work harder than anybody else. Know what you're capable of. That's encouraging the ego.
Yes.
That's just me giving him strength, at that point. That was me telling him he can do it. That was me, inspiring him to keep going.
Yep.
And our conversation was inspiration, encouragement, motivation, and support. The nature of the conversation between me and the other quarterback were very different because we're talking about, why does a part of you still have this drive towards sports? What do you really want out of this? Do you need something else out of this? So I'm like, the first conversation was encouraging, inspiring, and empowering the ego. The second one was about questioning, recognizing, and overcoming the ego. The first one with the young kid, because he wasn't there. He's just like, I want my time to shine. I'm the man, right? He's not trying to transcend his false self. He just wants somebody to be with him, and I knew that. I'm like, the first conversation was for the younger kid maintaining a positive view of the self on the way to success. The second one was about dying to the self on the way to freedom.
That's good.
Different journeys, different stages. That's us recognizing these. Like sometimes I would preach at our church because there's so many young people, and I would preach and be like, none of what I just said matters to you right now, basically, because you're 23. But in 10 years, when life punches you in the face and you realize this whole thing doesn't work the way you think it does.
This will be useful. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
That was a dilemma I found myself in. And that's the wisdom of stages of faith. That's the wisdom of stages of consciousness. And that's also the witness to different stages of the journey. Like you can have a positive view of yourself, but there's this mysterious thing the mystics point us to, which is a capital S self that exists before, beyond, and beneath.
Yes.
The self that you thought was yourself and you discovered in the end actually wasn't. It was more like an outfit you wore for a while. You don't need anymore.
I like that analogy a lot. One more little excerpt from the book and just kind of gets to a broader question. You mentioned Mirror by Star. Later on you talk about, you mentioned, you said this is why Richard Rohr says that all real spirituality is about letting go. This is why Meister Eckhart said, no one gets as much of God as those who are thoroughly dead. This is, and you said, and I think is it Ilia Delio? Yeah,
it's like Ilia Delio is how I would say it. Yeah.
Wrote to say, I will not die is to die. To be willing to die by surrendering to the freedom of the spirit is to live forever. These are sources. These are folks. These are guides in your life. Absolutely. Who've spoken to you. Who should folks be paying attention to in terms of familiarizing themselves with like this tradition? Mysticism as an idea for folks is sort of an idea, and we say the word mysticism, and somehow like everyone everyone thinks like you have to leave, go to the desert, you have no more clothes, you cannot wear underwear, there are no shoes, it's but there are guides and that are well within the tradition that Christians even specifically actually still belong to. Who should folks be paying attention to, along with picking your book up, which is called The Making of a Mystic?
Obviously.
Like who are you paying attention to? Who should folks be paying attention to get a familiarity with these practices, the stages of life, stages of faith, stages of development? Like, who should folks be reading?
No, that's great. One, I want to say something first before the resources and the people who have shaped me and I see the different mystics as all different unique open doors to the same river that's been flowing through humanity. There's different ways to get in. You don't need to know everybody to get into the river, but they're all like different rafts you hop on that help you get into the river. And people have different entry points. But one, I think besides, yes, the book tells some of my own story. It's not chronological, but it tells glimpses of my own story, the making of a mystic, what made me who I am.
Yeah.
But also, and I'm glad, like, you pick up on that in a sense, for me, it's the actual feel for the mysticism of every day. So when mysticism or mystics feels very abstract or mysterious or strange or dangerous or scary to people.
Yeah.
To me, when you read the book, it's about non-dual seeing, and it's also about choosing your kids over building a platform. It's about allowing yourself. Do you ever cuss on here? Should I not say this? It's in the book.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of cussing here.
I have a chapter in the book called "Feeling Shitty," and so I'm like, it's about allowing yourself to feel shitty sometimes as a leader without trying to perform your way out of your feelings. That's what a mystic is like on that Monday morning. That's what it feels like. It's about pastoring and creating from a liberated place that knows it has what its false self already seeks through its creation. It's the cosmic, and it's the cosmic patterns and the concrete person. It's zooming out and then zooming in on our lives. Because even something like non-dual consciousness, which feels so strange. No, but the non-dual has very practical fruit in your life of you no longer see the world as something to overcome and fight.
Yes.
And Jesus already said, I have overcome the world.
Yep.
So we don't have to conquer. Life isn't something to conquer. That's a different way of approaching all this. So to me, the book is not about one thing. It's about many things. And then it's the discovery that the many things is all about one thing.
That's really good.
Book to feel the everyday flesh and blood. The best translation of the word of God is not in Greek and Hebrew. It's in flesh and blood.
That's very good.
Times through your own life. But now for the people you mentioned, sometimes old writers, they're hard to get into because they're writing in such a different way. It's like, let's go read the early church fathers. I'm like, personally, I'm straight. Like, no, thank you. I have a desire to go read, I don't even know, Irenaeus or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I'll read some of the great quotes from other writers, and I don't care personally.
Good. Yeah, boil that down for me. Let me know how it goes. Exactly.
I know their role, and I do see it in the larger flow of the tradition, but I'm also like, I don't need to go back to that personally. So sometimes older writers are tough. So when it comes to some of the living mystics in the West, or at least who are accessible in the West right now, who I see, Richard Rohr as a Christian, to me, is definitely at the leading edge of human consciousness. What Ken Wilber would call the leading tip of human evolution. I think for a Christian in the West, he's like, Daddy Rohr. It's like, will you be my dad? Will you be my grandpa Rohr? Like, take me in. Can I come stay with you in the summer?
Yes.
So definitely Rohr, and don't like, people know Universal Christ. There's new books. I'm like, dude, go if you can go back. Rohr was saying things 30 years ago.
Yes.
That's just now starting to be accepted and appreciated in the broader culture.
His book Everything Belongs. His book Everything Belongs was the one, like, was handed to me by someone, and it was because we were having this conversation earlier on about this exactly. Like, I would like to feel more okay with myself as I'm growing. Was the conversation, like, really early on in faith? Like, I shouldn't feel shitty for needing to grow or wanting to grow. Like, I shouldn't be propelled by guilt. I want to be drawn in by belovedness. And this friend of mine handed me Everything Belongs, and it reoriented everything for me. It was like the spark. So if you don't want to read the voluminous, the Universal Christ, go back to, like, because Everything Belongs is like 110 pages, super simple,
tiny book.
It's beautiful.
You guys couldn't see, it's a podcast, it's not visual, but I had my eyes closed, nodding up and down for like 10 seconds while he was saying that, because that also for me, I would say maybe around 2008, when I was like, second year of Bible college. Like, this is good, but also it doesn't fully name my experience. Thinking about what I went through when I read Everything Belongs, I was like, this is the first thing I've seen naming my experience.
That's it.
And like you said, that's a power of language. The categories are both naming, and as a result of the naming, giving clarity and therefore deepening and extending.
Exactly.
You know.
Yep.
So yes, like Everything Belongs is, to me, that's probably the first book I would give to a lot of people for Roar.
It's a great book.
So I think for a Christian, Roar, you look at something like Mirabai Starr, you know, is a Jewish woman who writes in an inner spiritual sense. You know, she doesn't identify with one tradition. She does stuff at the CAC at Roar's place, you know, so she's connected with Roar and all of them. But Mirabai Starr's recent book, Wild Mercy, about the divine feminine, was one of the greatest surprising gifts for me of the last few years.
Wow.
And I don't mean because I viewed her in a negative way. I wasn't extremely familiar with her yet. I'd heard the name, but I didn't read her. When I read that book, there's not a lot of times now where I'm like really surprised by seeing a new space that I can tell has the energetic signature of the mystic.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that because it's so rare. And her book, Wild Mercy, and she has a book called God is Love, or The God of Love.
The God of Love.
8 or 10 years ago. Yeah.
It's very good.
Those two, and Wild Mercy, I was like, wow, like it moved me, you know. And I've been in a stage the past few years where I barely read because I have little kids and I've been writing. I just don't read anymore, to be honest. I just had to accept that.
Yep.
Like at nighttime, the kids go down, I read 3 pages. I'm like, I feel accomplished and exhausted. I don't even know how I used to read.
All done.
You know, I'm done.
All done. Yes.
So if you're comfortable, depending on the listeners, when someone who's not a Christian, Mirabai Starr, honestly, anybody who's connected at Roar, seeing James Finley, his podcast, Turning to the Mystics, through Roar CAC, is so good. Cynthia Bourgeot, the wisdom, if you want a more evolved second tier of consciousness, awakened Jesus, the wisdom Jesus is written in 2008, is so good. And also I would say, you know how in different stages of our life, if you're really a learner and really reading and really growing and you're into that, you have like a person who's like, that's the person I'm quoting all the time right now.
Yep.
You know, it's for 2 years, it's Peter Rollins, and for 3 years, it's Rob Bell, then it's N.T. Wright when I'm learning about new creation and my head's exploding, you know, back 15 years ago or whatever.
Yes. And
then it's this person. Think about this. Roar is that person for many people, including myself, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Now, Roar has been consistently quoting and drawing from Ken Wilber for about 30 years. So think about the wisdom, the evolution, the expansiveness, the intellect, the greatness of Roar's contribution. And Wilber is to Roar what Roar is to so many of us, right?
Yes.
Ken Wilber's work, whenever I got into it, it takes a lot to get into. It's like being initiated into a new philosopher because, like language, he has his own lexicon of language. Mm-hmm. Wilber's work for the past, for me, 7-ish years, that's the one.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, anybody who's giving, like, Roar has Wilber has a book called Integral Spirituality he wrote in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
We're not even there.
No.
People aren't even there.
His book,
it's 30 years ago.
Was it the theory? There's Integral Vision, and then there's one called I think it's called The Theory of Everything or something along those lines.
Yeah. Theory of Everything, one of his smaller books. You know, there's other books to get into, but Wilber for me is the great invisible voice that's leading so many other people who are translating. Like even so much of Rob's stuff now. I'm like, you know, obviously Rob's definitely a learner from Wilber. You know. But I mean, for me, Roar, Mirabai Starr, you know, there's a few voices now. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, the Buddhist monk
who recently
passed away. I try to say his name a little like not Thich Nhat Hanh, but like Thich Nhat Hanh because my wife's family is Vietnamese, so my mom's got the inside scoop.
You get corrected.
My mother-in-law's got the pronunciation.
Yeah.
But all of his works, you know, being peace, you know. He has one about, you know, the Buddha and the Christ. I can't think of the name right now. You know, living Buddha, living Christ. Like Thich Nhat Hanh as a modern day mystic who I have one of his quotes up on our wall in our house where he's like, the miracle is not to walk on water, the miracle is to walk on the green earth in the present moment. Like he's for
fantastic.
him. Yeah, I mean, Rohr, Thich Nhat Hanh, Mirabai Starr, these are some of the people around today. And also, I used to joke around about this back in the day. The only acceptable mystics for evangelicals is Henry Nouwen, who's also brilliant, and he's just safer for some reason,
But he'll point you to some deeper stuff as well. So
absolutely, and he himself, his stuff's amazing.
Yes,
he's
very, very good.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up this way. You mentioned, and we did, I mean, it's 2009 in San Diego. It's been 13 years. A lot has happened for you in 13 years. Life is, you are where you are now. More so in like a hopeful way rather than like making plans. 15 years from now, what will you hope for with regards to your church life? What would you hope for in terms of your personal life? What would you like? What would you hope to look like as a person, professionally, religiously, culturally? What do you hope that life looks like for you 15 years from now? How will you feel like? What would feel like growth 15 years from now?
There's a couple of things that make that specific, that make that a really interesting and pertinent question. One, in 15 years, our youngest son, we have an older daughter and a younger son, 3 and 5. In 15 years, my son will graduate high school. So that's interesting. At that point, my wife and I will be like, what does it mean to be an empty nester, assuming they both leave, and go to school on the mainland or something. So that's interesting. So I'll be 52 at that point. And also that is it's an interesting question for me right now, because we just announced the beginning of January that we're moving into the last chapter of the church that we started. So I'm actually walking through the last, hey, let's do an intentional 6 months just back at our place, small kind of conversational, just relational, before we close down the church we gave almost a decade of our life to. So it's a unique place. I will say this, when last fall was the season my wife and I were sort of coming to terms with, we reopened the church after COVID, and we're like, okay, where are we? What is this? Where are we as a church? Where are we? I always sensed I would do this role for about 10 years, and we're going into the 10th year, but this is like such a big rebuild. Like, what is happening? And started writing, and I have this book, and I have actually a second, you talked about letting go earlier. I never got back to that question, but my second, this is for the next time, because my second book is about letting go. Called The Joy of Letting Go. How one thing, this is a working title, how one thing has the power to change everything. And, we were in New York City right after Christmas with our kids. We surprised them with a trip, and I walked the High Line, one of the last days I was there. It's just like this converted train tracks, like an outdoor park. And I walked it very slow, contemplative, just in a conversation with myself, with God. And I said, oh, every 10 years, my life is completely upended. At 18, I had that radical experience of Christ, let go, defied everyone's expectations on me, moved to Hawaii to start over. At 28, we left Costa Mesa, moved back here to start Imagine, and my wife has her own practice. She's a marriage and family therapist, so we upended our life again and took a massive risk. I said, oh, I'm about to turn 38 next year, and it appears I'm approaching another one of those. With Imagine and moving beyond this role. So there is a lot of uncertainty in that. I will say I'll say personal and about the church as we wrap up. Personally, yes, there is all of the grief, and I'm a person who does not compartmentalize. I do not suspend hard things and let it all boil up. I'm through my practice, my daily practices, or however often I'm spending time in silence. Grief is just a natural thing that's woven into it. What do I need to let go of? What do I need to face? Oh, this thing. Okay. So with all the grief of the church, also there's an exciting, energized, liberated imagination and sense of my vocational life, because I knew along the way my greatest gifts and strengths do not express themselves in the role of a lead pastor kind of a person. I'm not organizationally minded. I'm not administrative. I'm not strategic. I'm not thinking about the future all the time. I just suck at that, and I get stuck trying to organize all that and delegate it. That's just being like self-deprecating. It's just honestly, I'm not great at it. I'm thankful because I learned along the way how to be better, and I'm grateful for that. And I know there are parts of me and the truth and of my own voice and what I can contribute that will have the freedom and the space to express themselves the next 10 years in ways they haven't yet. And I'm really excited for that. And this book is, the first big example of that, that I'm really excited for. And so personally, it's a life of continuing to write and continuing to create, and hopefully to meet more and more people along the way like yourself, to be like, man, these are people who I want to do things with and build with and do this event with and collaborate on this with. And I have the freedom to do that in a way when you're binding yourself to a community locally, which is good if that's the season of life. I wasn't doing. So for me, it's more this next year and a half or 2 years is writing, connecting, and building a relational path that begets more opportunities that are unknown to me right now.
That's really
so good. Personally, the church, I don't know, like Hawaii is a very unique place religiously. Like if I was in a Austin or I'm in a New York or I'm in a city like that, I could probably find a community of faith and a church where even if we're not exactly the same, I could still align with and be like, I could be here.
Yeah.
Like I could be here without being like, oh my God. And I could be here without being a total pain in their ass too, because I'm just like, come on.
Yeah.
And I, especially entrusting your kids to that community, that's a big thing now too, as well. And so I would love to have options in the future here to have communities that I feel like that with. I'm honestly just don't know if and when that will happen. And I'm still leading through this last season, so it's not urgent right now, but the broader thing is I want more spaces that are hopeful enough for people like me to feel good being a part of.
That's good. That's a great
That's what I hope for.
That's a great hope.
And I would love to be in a place in 5, 7, 10 years to help that.
Yeah.
I don't want to go back to this role. I ain't never starting no church. I'm not gonna be that role.
All done
but
there. Yes,
to be
I get that.
part of those things and support those people, like I would love that. So I still have that hope.
Yeah.
For other people to come and be like, this whole thing's expanding and getting wider, and we need structures and forums and communities that reflect that.
I love that. Well, man, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And thank you for joining me for this episode of the At Sea podcast. If you'd like to follow up with Kevin, I'd suggest checking him out on Instagram. It's simply Kevin Sweeney 1, the number 1. That's his whole handle. Kevin Sweeney, got 2 E's, Kevin Sweeney 1 at Instagram. Like I said, his book comes out on May 31st. It is called The Making of a Mystic. If, on the other hand, you would like to be one of the folks who makes these conversations possible, we'd love to have you on the team. Jump to patreon.com and just search my name, Justin McRoberts, and there I will be talking about this podcast. We've got a few things planned for the next phase of this podcast, and I'm going to be talking to patrons about that really, really soon. I'm looking forward to it, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. Until then,